They say betrayal never comes from your enemies. I never really believed that line until the day my entire world shattered. You see, enemies announce themselves. They come at you head-on and you can prepare, defend, fight back. But betrayal comes from the side with a smile still on the lips of the one you thought was safe. When I look back now, I can't say there weren't signs. There always are. Little things, small inconsistencies, unexplained silences. But love, real, blinding love, has this strange ability to blur the edges of reality. You convince yourself the strange tone in her voice is just stress. The hidden phone screen is just a bad habit. The sudden late nights are just work. That's what I told myself about Claire, my Claire. We had been together for almost 7 years. 7 years of laughter, of building a life from scratch, of inside jokes that no one else would understand. We weren't perfect, but then again, who is? We had routines, rituals. Sunday morning coffee runs, Tuesday dinners at that small Italian place downtown, Friday nights curled up with cheap wine and whatever movie we could agree on. To the outside world, we looked solid. To me, we were solid. And then came the unraveling. It didn't happen in one moment, like in the movies where the hero bursts into a room and finds his partner entangled with someone else. No, reality is slower, crueler. It starts with distance, with the way her eyes no longer lingered when I spoke, with how her phone became an extra limb, never out of reach, always tilted away from me, with laughter I hadn't earned, floating in from another room when I wasn't the one telling the joke. I wanted to believe it was just stress. Work had been heavy for her and I thought maybe she just needed space. I even tried harder, planning small surprises, being more attentive, more patient. But the more effort I put in, the further away she seemed to drift. It's like chasing a shadow at dusk. The closer you run, the faster it slips away. The day the truth revealed itself, I wasn't even looking for it. That's the cruelest part. I stumbled upon it like an unsuspecting traveler stepping onto quicksand. One careless move, and suddenly I was sinking. But before I tell you what I found, let me admit something. When you're betrayed, your mind doesn't just break, it begins to calculate. The pain is real, yes, but underneath it simmers something darker. A question forms. What do I do with this? Do I walk away quietly? Do I confront? Or do I teach a lesson that will be remembered long after I'm gone? That was the moment my story of love turned into a story of betrayal, and later, into something far more interesting. For a long time after the first cracks appeared, I tried to be the calm center, the steady hand that would guide us past whatever storm Claire was weathering. That itself became a kind of addiction, a belief that love could be workmanlike, that patience and small daily acts of repair could fix anything. I timed my gestures like a craftsman, a note under her pillow on Mondays, a cup of coffee waiting on her desk before she left for work, a bouquet from that corner florist who remembered her favorite runner's route. I thought those small rituals might be stitches that would hold the seam together. But the truth about fissures is that they are seductive. They widen slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the structure can no longer bear weight. The signs were mundane, everyday things that only become evidence in the retelling. A lipstick stain on the rim of her coffee mug one Tuesday morning, a receipt for a late-night dinner she said was a work thing, an unfamiliar fragrance that lingered in our bedroom and made the air feel like someone else had been there. She said she was tired. She said deadlines had her in a vice. I believed her because to believe otherwise felt like throwing gasoline on a small ember. We started arguing less about big issues and more about trivialities. The complaints were almost performative, too loud with the television, the wrong brand of milk in the fridge, the posture she kept when she read. They were small enough to be defensible and small enough to be about something other than the real thing. Sometimes she would win the argument, sometimes I would. The fights no longer cleared the air. They were smoke screens, ritualized exchanges that left both of us exhausted, but pretending we had resolved something. There were other, stranger things. She began to close the laptop when I entered the room. She would take her phone with her into the bathroom. She developed the habit of keeping her keys in a different pocket. The most unnerving thing was the way she looked at me sometimes, not with coldness, but with an absence, like a photograph viewed at a distance. It made me feel as if I were an actor in a well-rehearsed play where everyone remembered their lines except me. I tried to catalog the deviations. I bought boxes and labeled them with dates and observations, thinking that if I could externalize the pattern, I could make sense of it. On a rainy Saturday, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, a pen in my hand, filling the pages with observations. August 12, returned at 10:45, perfume. August 19, phone screen turned away. August 23, lipstick on mug. August 27, unexplained dinner receipt. The list read like a slow confession. Every line was another grain added to the pile that would eventually become a mountain. During this time, I also re-examined the softer parts of Claire I had neglected. She was generous in ways that mattered. She remembered my sister's birthday. She could tell when I stopped taking my meds. She could coax the lazy smile out of me on my worst days. Somewhere between gratitude and fear, I started to romanticize those moments, as if by holding them tight I could ward off the threatening discontinuity. I clung to the past like a talisman. The night we drove up the coast and slept in the car because we missed the last motel. The morning she returned my father's old watch that I had thought lost, ticking again and suddenly important. I told myself these memories were reasons to trust. In hindsight, they were the softening that made the blow worse. One night after a dinner where she seemed particularly distant, I left a book on the couch with a photograph I had taken of us the summer before. It was a small, childish test. If she moved it, perhaps it would signal she recognized what was happening between us. She noticed it the next morning and smiled, but the smile was fleeting. "You left this here," she said, and there was no curiosity in her voice, only the neutral cadence of someone pointing out the weather. Her indifference felt like a verdict. I'm not proud of everything I did next. When suspicion lodges inside a chest, it becomes a lodestone for behavior that would formerly have been foreign. I started to watch, not in the cinematic way, no stakeouts. No dramatic confrontations in dimly lit parking garages. Instead, it was smaller, almost ridiculous. I timed her comings and goings, cataloged the names that appeared on her email, learned the pattern of her laughter in the morning calls. I would pretend to be asleep and listen to the click of the lock, the whisper of fabric. I learned how long it took her to brush her hair, the soft rhythm of her breathing when she read on the couch. The everyday minutiae of a person you love become like a map. You think you know the terrain until you see a path that was never there before. There were moments where I attempted confrontation, but those conversations dissolved into apology and explanation. She would say, "I've been so frazzled," or "It's nothing, I promise," and I would believe her because I wanted to be the man who believed her. Once, in a moment of careless honesty, she admitted to flirting with someone at a work event months ago. It was nothing, just a laugh, a compliment. I let it go because it still fit the narrative that kept me sane. Besides, what could I do with a shadow of a flirtation? Call it jealousy and look petty. Ask for proof and look paranoid. The social scripts are cruelly stacked in favor of plausible deniability. And yet other episodes resisted being normalized. She came home one evening with a small dent on the back of her hand and said she had bumped it on a door. The way she explained it made my stomach drop. The story was too clean. Once, in a grocery store, I caught a glimpse of a text preview on her phone from a name I didn't know, 2 words, a winking emoji, and my heart blackened. I didn't confront her then. Instead, I stared at the oranges in the produce aisle and tried to practice the kind of composure I had seen on other people's faces. Calm, resolved, polite. As days turned into weeks, the doubt stopped being a small ache and became a structural part of my life. It crept into our routines in practical ways. I stopped packing her lunch in the morning because the thought of reaching into the fridge and finding something that betrayed me felt unbearable. I stopped sharing passwords, stopped leaving the house unlocked. I would wake at odd hours and scroll through old email threads. piecing together fragments of conversation that my rational mind dismissed as the last grasping fingers of paranoia. Despite everything, there were still moments of tenderness. We would have dinners where she seemed entirely present, where the conversation flowed and the laughter felt honest. Those evenings were treacherous. They were the bait that kept me from taking a single clean action, either to leave or to confront with certainty. I clung to them like ice to a drowning hand. They were proof that nothing was irreparably broken, and that cognitive dissonance is an effective anesthetic. I remember clearly the day my posture shifted from suspicion to determination. It was a gray Thursday. She kissed me before work, a brief, perfunctory brush, and left with a bag that felt heavier than usual. She called at noon with a rattle of forced cheeriness about meetings that ran long. When she returned that evening, she smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. Not a sharp, cloying perfume, but a clean, quiet scent that told stories about other people's laundry and close conversations. That night I lay awake and finally acknowledged something I had been avoiding. I didn't want to be the man who simply swallowed the explanation. I wanted to know. Not for the sake of punishment, not yet, but because certainty felt like the only currency I had left that would buy me a way forward. I resolved that I would not let the story be rewritten through excuses and small deceptions. I would observe, catalog, and when the time came, act with the clarity of someone who had been given a set of facts and could no longer live in the dark. The plan wasn't revenge yet. It was the solidifying of will. I would gather proof, but proof not to publicly shame or to throw like a grenade at our life. Proof to understand. Proof to make sure that whatever decisions I made next were rooted in truth, and not in the fevered imagination that betrayal tends to inflame. So I began to look for patterns rather than single acts. I started knotting times on a calendar, not with accusation but with method. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, her late nights, Tuesday and Thursday, early returns. I sketched out routes she might take through the city when she said she was going to the office. I observed where her energy seemed to come from and where it drained away. It was clinical work, the kind of careful, statistical observation that turns messy human life into data. When people ask me why I did not confront her then, I always struggle for honesty. Confrontation is primal and immediate. It is the dramatic moment novels love. But real life is different. Confrontation without certainty feels like walking blindfolded toward a precipice. There's the fear of being the fool, but also the fear of losing something worth saving. I had not yet decided whether our bond was salvageable. The question was whether I could accept whatever answer I found. At the end of that week, I was not yet at the point of discovery. I had tightened the net and sharpened my attention. I had transformed my pain into practice. The slow work of surveillance, humane, petty, methodical, was underway. Somewhere ahead of me was the moment when the curtains would be pulled back. I didn't know whether it would be explosive or anticlimactic. I only knew it could no longer be avoided. And there, in that place between suspicion and truth, the story sat waiting. Certainty never arrives with a trumpet. It slips in quietly, so subtle you almost miss it. For me, it came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The kind of evening where the city outside the window feels half asleep, with the hum of traffic blending into a dull backdrop. Claire had said she'd be late again, something about back-to-back meetings and then drinks with a few colleagues. By then I had stopped even asking for details. The answers came too smoothly, like lines memorized long before. I sat at the kitchen table, half reading an article online, half listening to the hollow silence of the apartment. I don't know why I did it, why that particular night felt different. Maybe it was instinct, maybe fatigue from weeks of suspicion. I opened her laptop. It wasn't locked. Claire never locked it, perhaps because she trusted me, or perhaps because she assumed I would never look. At first there was nothing. Emails, spreadsheets, project files. Mundane, predictable. I almost closed it, embarrassed at myself for stooping so low. And then I saw it. A folder buried inside her work directory, with a name so bland it looked designed to be ignored. Drafts sold. I clicked. Inside were dozens of Word documents, nothing unusual at first glance. Meeting notes, proposals, but halfway down the list, One file caught my attention. M-Notes DocX. The name was too vague, but it carried the scent of something hidden. My hand trembled as I opened it. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but it was enough. Friday was amazing. Can't believe we got away with it. I still smell you on me, counting down to next time. M. The timestamp was from 3 days earlier. The night she had come home flushed and smiling, saying she'd finally cracked a difficult project with her team. I remember staring at the words, my chest tightening, the air leaving my lungs as if the room had been vacuum sealed. There was no explicit name, no photograph, no smoking gun beyond those sentences. But I knew. The casual intimacy, the reckless confidence, it didn't belong to me. It never had. I closed the laptop quietly, as though the machine itself might scream if I pressed too hard. Then I sat back, waiting for the panic to come, but what arrived instead was a strange calm. The kind of calm that appears in the seconds after a car crash, when the world feels sharp and distant, like glass glittering on asphalt. I didn't confront her that night. When Claire finally walked through the door around 10, she smelled faintly of wine and the wind. She kissed me on the cheek, careless, distracted. I kissed her back, and for the first time I felt nothing. Just skin against skin, hollow, like pressing my lips to a mannequin. That was when the nature of my thoughts changed. It wasn't simply about betrayal anymore. It was about the game, about the knowledge she didn't know I had, about the delicate balance of power that had shifted without her realizing it. I began to notice everything more sharply after that. The way she hummed while brushing her teeth, the faint tremor in her hands when she checked her phone, the subtle hesitation in her stories when I asked questions I already knew the answers to. I played the role of the oblivious partner perfectly. I laughed at her jokes, I asked about her day, I listened with just enough interest to seem real. And all the while I began constructing something. Not rage, not even revenge yet, something more deliberate. A framework, a way to turn her own choices into a mirror she could never look away from. The hardest part was patience. To sit across from her at dinner, watching her smile at me with lips that had spoken those words to someone else. To share a bed, knowing the sheets still carried echoes I couldn't wash out. Patience burned like acid, but it also sharpened me. The folder on her laptop became my quiet secret. I checked it again the next morning, carefully, never altering anything, just observing. More notes had appeared. They weren't long, just fragments. Little sentences, coded but obvious if you already knew the truth. Next week, same place. I'll handle the excuse. You drive me crazy. Can't stop thinking about your laugh. No names, just the same initial M. I wondered if she chose that letter to disguise him, or if it was his real initial. That ambiguity gnawed at me, but in another way it gave me an opening. I didn't need the full truth yet. I needed enough to shape the story, to bend it toward the ending I had in mind. Because here's the thing about betrayal. Once you've seen it, you stop thinking like a victim. You start thinking like a strategist, and strategies take time. So I waited. I smiled. I made her breakfast the next morning, kissed her goodbye, and wished her luck on her early meeting. And all the while I was already deciding how, when the time was right, I would return the favor, not with screams, not with violence, not even with exposure. Something subtler, something she wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. Once certainty arrived, the temptation was simple and loud. Expose, explode, end everything in a single dramatic moment. Movies make that satisfying. A single cry, a shattered plate, a door slammed hard enough to echo. Real life rarely offers that kind of tidy spectacle. It offers choices. What kind of person do you want to be now that you know the truth? I had been a craftsman of routines for years. It made sense to use craft now, to turn procedural attention into something that moved with deliberate, almost surgical calm. First, practicalities. Nothing romantic happens without structure. I separated our finances quietly, not out of spite but to buy myself options. I moved accounts, signed the paperwork for an old home repair under my name alone, changed the passwords I had shared without a note that would provoke her. These were not dramatic gestures. They were compound interest on dignity. Each small administrative act felt like reclaiming a little ground that had been lost to complacency. The legal stuff was necessary. If the future required distance, it should be built on firm foundations, not the erosion of overnight decisions. But money and contracts are antiseptic. They don't produce the emotion I wanted to reckon with, if reckoning was even the right word. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had chosen, the subtle, humiliating reality of being seen for what she had become. Not a public lynching. That was cheap and would satisfy only the basest appetite, but a reflection so precise that she could not ignore the person in the mirror. The revenge, I imagined, had to be elegant because cruelty is easy, and I didn't want to be easy. I began collecting objects, not trophies, not scenes to stage, but evidence as artifacts, little things that told truthful stories without shouting. A lipstick smear on a napkin from a restaurant she had claimed was empty, a folded receipt with a time that didn't match her account, screenshots of the sentences she had typed and accidentally saved to drafts. I stored them in a small box with the same obsessive tenderness I had once reserved for ticket stubs from our early dates. Each item was a sentence in a private book I was assembling, an inventory not of guilt to fling at her, but of the reality that would inform every graceful next move. Parallel to the practical and the archival, I changed on the inside. Rather than rehearsing scenes of confrontation, I rewrote my own script. I started taking long walks in new neighborhoods, sitting in cafes I had never visited, listening instead of speaking. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected, not as a show, but because people are stabilizers. Human contact gave me perspective. In social gatherings, I practiced being interesting rather than reactive. The quiet irony became one of my sharpest tools. When a person who hurt you expects you to be diminished, the simple act of flourishing is a subtle blade. The core of the plan was not to humiliate her in front of strangers, but to remove the illusion she had been feeding on. Most affairs survive on the fuel of secrecy and private narrative. Lovers create a cocoon where their transgressions are never named, where euphemism floats like insulation. If you puncture the cocoon from the outside with a new, undeniable narrative, one she cannot control, her comfort evaporates. I would not schedule a spectacle. I would rearrange the furniture of our lives so that the truth could no longer be an occupant in the same room without being noticed. That rearrangement took several forms. Professionally, I made moves that were quiet but visible. I took a course relevant to my work and started contributing ideas that people noticed. I volunteered for a small committee at a local cultural center, and within weeks, a few acquaintances mentioned my name at the right circles. The aim was not to flaunt success, but to re-anchor my identity in places she had taken for granted. One of the cruelest things infidelity does is convince the betrayed that their world ends at the edge of the bed. Reclaiming public life is a way to show the bed is only a thin slice of existence. Socially, I reshaped our shared map. There were friends who had been neutral, some who had been aligned with her in small ways. I didn't stage an exposé for them. Instead, I allowed moments to be seen differently. At gatherings, I asked questions that encouraged honesty, told stories that invited candid responses. People naturally filled narrative voids with assumptions. I made sure the voids were smaller. When someone mentioned a recent trip she had taken, I commented with precision about the neighborhood they visited, details that implied knowledge. It was a tiny inversion. Instead of her stories creating the narrative, my presence made cultivated facts that made her omissions stand out. Another element of the plan was aesthetic. I began writing, not confession, not accusation, but short, spare pieces about loss and disillusionment without obvious biographical markers. They were fiction, technically, but they contained emotional truths culled from our life. I sent one to a small literary collective under a pen name. It was accepted and read aloud at a private reading. People approached me afterward with softness and curiosity. The piece hadn't named her, but those who knew us heard the cadence of our life and the cut of the sentences. That tremulous empathy is powerful. It shifted the way some mutual acquaintances regarded the story's protagonist. They started to listen with different ears. Perhaps the most delicate stroke was the mirror. I did not confront her with a parade of evidence. I created situations in which she would see her choices reflected back at her by themselves. I spent evenings arranging meetings with people from her past, colleagues she respected, an old professor who had once been a mentor. The encounters weren't traps. They were opportunities for ordinary conversation into which the truth could edge. In one case, an ex-mentor complimented her on her composure during a difficult fiscal quarter. She smiled, pleased, then offhandedly mentioned how tired she was. The mentor, with a decades-long habit of watching character, gently asked what was tiring her. Her answer, clipped and practiced, sounded hollow in that older ear. He didn't accuse, he simply remarked on the unsustainability of living two lives. Those words, soft, observant, external, slowly wore at her cover. There was also an emotional tactic I kept to myself, something I knew would hurt more than any social setback: absence arranged as presence. Instead of demanding to be seen, I made my absence in some areas deliberate so when I reappeared it would be loaded with meaning. I stopped being instantly available. I declined calls when there was no reason to pick up other than habit. When I did return, I did so with poise, not petulance. She noticed, of course. People noticed changed availability. What she felt I could not dictate. Feelings are unpredictable. But the effect was clear. Where before my availability had been a silent acceptance, now it registered as a choice. Importantly, I never intended her ruin. Cruelty bores me. The revenge I cultivated was a surgical unmasking that let the world recalibrate its perception of her on the basis of facts and the quiet testimony of changed behavior. If she lost some social currency, it would be because the story she had been selling had fewer buyers. If she felt the loss more sharply, it would be my doing only insofar as I had chosen to stop insulating her from consequence. The plan required patience, and patience is its own kind of cruelty. There were evenings when my restraint felt like cowardice and mornings when every small victory tasted faint as bread. But slowly, the architecture of the new narrative took shape. Friends asked questions with a different tilt. She found herself explaining things she had never thought to explain before. The net I had woven was not visible. It was a pattern of small changes that, when taken together, altered the gravity around her life. There was a final, private piece to the plan, one I would not reveal aloud. It involved a letter, simple, unadorned, written in my best hand. Not a manifesto, not an accusation. A ledger of truth, the dates, the artifacts, the small sentences from her drafts, every item I had collected. I would not mail it. I would set it in a place where she could find it if she wanted to know, and if she did not, then the knowledge of the ledger's existence would be enough to change her choices. The letter was less about forcing her to read the facts and more about giving her the agency to confront them. The greatest power I could wield was the power to offer the truth without demanding she accept it. With every step, the plan felt less like revenge and more like a reestablishment of equilibrium. Betrayal had been an asymmetry in our shared story. I intended to balance the ledger through craft and self-possession, not spectacle. It was, I believed, the most honest way to respond to deceit, not by matching it with its twin, but by becoming someone whose life no longer fit the cheap contours her choices had tried to draw. The night before the next phase, when I would put certain pieces into motion, I sat alone in the apartment with the box of artifacts on the table. The light from the street lamp slipped in across the floor, thin and patient. I read the drafts again, traced the edges of the napkin, folded the letter and slid it into an envelope with a steady hand. There was no catharsis, only a clear sense that I had done what I could to shape my response with intention. The rest would be about timing, cunning in the quiet sense. Where to let a conversation land, which acquaintance to include in a small dinner, what public space would make certain private admissions awkward in a way that couldn't be shrugged off. I felt, for the first time since the discovery, less like a man waiting to be defined by another's choice, and more like someone who had begun to write the next chapter himself. The pen was not an instrument of punishment. It was a tool for narrative justice, the kind that doesn't humiliate so much as disentangle. There would be wounds, there would be consequences, but there would also be room for her to become less of what she had been. Whether she would choose to do that was another story entirely. I sealed the envelope and placed it back in the box. The plan, now formed, waited like a held breath. The week the plan began to breathe was ordinary in all the ways that matter. Claire kept her schedule, walked the same streets, smiled at the same barista. I kept mine. The small changes I had set in motion were invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. To those who did, they accumulated like quiet snow until the world looked different underfoot. It started with conversations that were precise but unaccusing. At a small dinner with people who had known both of us for years, I asked about resilience, careful, general questions that invited stories rather than confessions. Someone spoke about how easy it is to compartmentalize pain when it's convenient. A neighbor mentioned the way couples can create private dialects to avoid hard truths. Claire listened and laughed, but the laughter had less buoyancy than before. After the meal, a friend, an honest man with a habit of seeing things as they are, pulled her aside and asked, in a voice meant to be soft, not cruel, whether she was sleeping enough. He didn't say what I already knew. He simply named what everyone suspected: exhaustion that wears like a disguise. My short pieces of fiction, the ones stitched from fragments of our life, circulated in small, local ways. People who'd been there the night I'd read one of them, the one about a man making a ledger of small, seemingly harmless betrayals, looked at Claire differently. They asked gentle questions. They caught themselves looking for patterns. You wouldn't call it gossip. It was more like a reframing. A narrative had shifted from the private to a public lean, and when the public leans, private stories tremble. The more delicate moves were the ones that involved memory. I began to remind people, in half-remembered ways, of the small acts that had once defined her generosity. Not to flatter her, but to make the contrast sharper. The woman who had once stayed up correcting my resumes, the woman who had smuggled sorbet into my hands when I was sick. Those memories made her current evasions less plausible. People tend to defend a story they believe in. By recalling the older narrative, I made the new one harder to maintain without explanation. At work, I never raised a finger to sabotage her career. That would have been petty, and besides, our lives had enough friction without me manufacturing more. Instead, I cultivated allies whose casual observations had weight. A colleague mentioned, as if by accident, that Claire had seemed distracted at a recent meeting and had missed a small but telling detail in a report. An acquaintance, whose tastes in people were blunt, complimented her on her polish, and then in the same breath remarked how hollow polish can be when it isn't attached to truth. These weren't attacks. They were small reframings, stories that nudge the shorthand people use when describing someone. People update their shorthand with the least amount of cognitive effort. If the shorthand around Claire changed, her personal mythology would thin without anyone needing to raise a torch. There were also private movements. I left the envelope, the one with the ledger and the artifacts, in a place I knew she would eventually check. The coat she wore for late nights, the one she tossed over the back of a chair and left by the bedroom door. I didn't plan it like a trap. I placed it as if I had forgotten it. The idea was the same as everything else. Agency remained hers. If she chose to open it, she would do it on her own terms. If she never opened it, then I had still shifted the furniture of our life by simply making the truth materially available. On the night of the reading, I kept things simple. The venue was a small gallery that smelled faintly of oil paint and espresso, a place that drew people who liked sentences better than spectacle. I did not advertise Claire's presence. I did not invite her. I made sure a few mutual friends who I trusted would attend, not as witnesses but as gentle bridges. Under a pen name, I read the piece that held the most detail, thinly veiled and precise, the tiny moments that would resonate, the napkin, the saved draft, the times he had promised to handle the excuse. I read without flourish. There was no showmanship. The emotion lived in the facts laid out plainly. Afterward, as people clustered and talked, Claire slipped in. She had arrived quietly, sat at the back, and watched. I had not known she would come. When she caught my eye across the room, there was a flicker, a pretense of composure that did not quite hold. The reading ended and people came up with soft praise and questions about the craft. Someone hugged me as if I had been brave talking about loss. Claire hovered, polite, near the periphery. She pretended to be casual, but the angle of her shoulders betrayed her. We did not exchange words that night. I waited until the last possible moment, then left through the back alley and watched as she stepped into the street and hailed a cab. What I wanted was not a confrontation. What I wanted was to let the story feed into her world through other mouths, so it would no longer inhabit only mine. If someone else's empathy could reach her, maybe she would see differently. If the reading made her uneasy, the ledger might then become a choice rather than an accusation. A few days later, I saw the effect of the reading in small ways. Someone texted me that Claire had messaged them asking if they had been at the gallery. A mutual friend told me Claire had asked incredulously whether I had written the piece. Another acquaintance, with the aristocratic cruelty of a bored observer, recounted overhearing Claire ask someone in a cafe whether the themes in the reading were really necessary. The net was pulling tighter, not by force but by narrative tension. Each retelling bent reality, a fraction more toward the account I had been holding in my box. The envelope, meanwhile, moved in the quiet of a few days. It sat under the coat for a while, then on a shelf, unnoticed. I would catch myself imagining her hands on the paper, whether she would fold it, whether her hands would shake as mine had when I first read the drafts. I resisted the urge to open her privacy further. That would have been to manipulate rather than to offer. The principle of the plan was always the same: expose without violating. Make the truth visible. Preserve people's ability to choose how to respond. Finally, the moment arrived, not with the drama I had imagined, but with the small, almost ridiculous clarity of everyday life. She was in the bedroom, searching for a scarf she claimed she had misplaced. I was in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes but listening. The rustle of fabric, the soft curse, the muffled laughter that sounded like someone forcing themselves to be brave. Then the drawer, her movement matched the old familiarity. I heard paper slip. For a second I paused, throat tight. Then she walked into the kitchen with an envelope in her hand, the paper folded at the edge. She stood there for a long time, as if the room itself could offer counsel. Her mouth moved once, no sound, a small rehearsed shape of a prayer. The envelope was pale in her fingers, the handwriting familiar enough to sting. She did not open it. Instead, she sat on the couch and put it on the coffee table, like a Bible no one dared to touch. Her hands came to her face and she pressed her palms to her eyes, the old habit of a woman who had learned to be composed in public and private her tears. I watched her in a way that was not voyeuristic but curious, the way you study a bird you once knew the flight of. I wanted to speak, to say something that might make the paper dissolve into nothing. I wanted to pat her knee and remind her of the nights we had been kind to each other. I wanted to tell her I had never wished for things to be easy, only honest. But I had made choices, and one of them was to honor the agency of this moment. If she opened the envelope, she would do it because she wanted to know. If she did not, that choice would also be hers. She sat there a long time, so long the apartment seemed to contract around that single figure. The light in the window slanted differently than it had the week before. Outside, a bus sighed, a neighbor's radio hummed. She touched the flap of the envelope and then lifted her hand away. Her fingers trembled now, not with the practiced steadiness she sometimes wore, but with the rawness of a person who must choose how to live with what she knows. I thought of the ledger, of all the painstaking small truths I had collected. I thought of how each fact had a different weight in daylight than in the secrecy of drafts and napkins. I left the room then, not because I wanted to abandon her, but because there was nothing left to do that could not be done by paper and hand and choice. I went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed and listened. I measured the silence in breaths, the slow in, the slow out. The clock ticked. The apartment had the same furniture, the same scent of lemon cleaner, but something fundamental had shifted. The axis on which our small world had turned had moved a fraction and would never be the same. What happened next is a matter of detail and tone, two things that determine how people remember a story. In a later telling, I would find that those who heard it imagined a dramatic scene. The envelope ripped open, accusations shouted, doors slammed. In my memory, it was quieter. She unfolded the envelope with the patience of someone opening a medicine bottle. She read. Her face moved through a map of expressions: confusion, denial, acceptance, a strange, small relief. When she reached the last page of the ledger, she sat back as if the weight of holding it had changed shape. Then she looked around the room, as if seeing it, to be precise, to be honest, was a new task. I do not know whether she forgave herself for the parts she had to own. I do not know whether she thought of the other man as a monster or a mirror. I do not know if she blamed me for making the ledger or thanked me for giving her the choice. What I know is that the envelope did not produce immediate spectacle. It produced contemplation. It produced a space that could have led to different outcomes and, importantly, left the door open for either. When she finally spoke, the sentence was not a shriek nor a confession. It was small, as if testing the world to see if it still held meaning. "I didn't know he saved anything," she said. It was a line that tried to explain, to excuse, to connect, none of which were sufficient. I did not answer. I sat in the bedroom and felt the slow, odd competence of someone who had acted not out of instinct but out of intention. Outside, the city kept moving. People on the street bought coffee, argued about trains, missed calls. Inside, an ordinary apartment held two people who could no longer pretend everything was the same. The ledger lay on the table like an object that had done its work by simply existing. And somewhere between the reading and the envelope, between the small public shifts and the private revelation, the precise thing I had wanted happened. The world had more than one possible account now. I do not tell you what happened at midnight or dawn or that week. That would be to force a tidy end on a story that is not tidy. Instead, I leave you with the image of Claire sitting on the couch, the envelope open beside her, the city light cutting across the floor. Her hand rested on the page as if to anchor herself. The question, would she stay, would she leave, would she rebuild or unravel, hung in the room like a chord waiting to be resolved. And like any good chord, it asks for an answer that is both immediate and deferred. The strangest thing about the days that followed was not the confrontation itself, because there wasn't one in the classic sense, but the silence. Not an absence of words, but a silence layered with meanings, as if every sentence we spoke contained an echo of the ledger sitting on the coffee table. Claire went about her routine, but the rhythms had shifted. When she greeted me in the morning, there was a hesitation, a pause just before my name left her lips. At night, she stayed longer in the shower, as if the hot water could wash away the words she had read. She lingered over her phone less, but when she did glance at it, her face betrayed something between guilt and longing. I didn't confront her. That had never been the plan. The plan was to tilt the axis, to make silence itself speak louder than accusations. And it worked. The apartment had become a theater, every chair and window a witness. One evening, she sat across from me with a glass of wine she barely touched. She stared at the glass, tracing its rim with her fingertip, before asking a question so ordinary it became profound. "Do you think people can change?" It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an admission. But the way she asked it carried weight, as though the question was less about human nature and more about her reflection in the window behind me. I answered carefully. People can learn, but learning doesn't always mean changing. Her eyes flickered, as if she wanted to challenge me, then softened. She looked down, murmured something I couldn't quite hear, and changed the subject. That was how most of our exchanges went. She would circle the truth without landing, and I would let her orbit in silence. Meanwhile, the stories continued to ripple outward. Friends who had been at the reading brought it up in casual settings, not connecting Claire directly but sensing parallels. Someone at a dinner party remarked that it was brutally honest, and I saw Claire's hand freeze halfway to her fork. At work, she began arriving earlier, staying later, her way of tightening control where she could. But strange shows in subtler ways, in the way her laugh faltered half a beat too early, in the way she avoided eye contact when certain names came up. One night I found her sitting on the floor by the bookshelf, the envelope beside her. She had spread out its contents, pages of notes, fragments of text, the napkin. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even reading. She was just sitting among them as if proximity alone might rewrite what they meant. When she noticed me, she quickly gathered everything back into the envelope, almost violently, like someone shoving secrets back into a drawer. But the damage was already done. She knew I had seen her vulnerable in a way she couldn't mask. That was when the true shift began. Claire started to mirror my own silence. She no longer tried to defend herself nor to fabricate excuses. She didn't confess either. Instead, she moved through the days with a tension that felt like waiting for what I wasn't sure. Maybe for me to explode, maybe for herself to break, maybe for something in between. The cruel irony was that the ledger, my weapon, had become her mirror. Every time she saw it, every time she touched it, she wasn't just reminded of her betrayal. She was reminded that I knew, and that I had chosen not to destroy her outright. That knowledge lingered heavier than any argument could. I realized then that revenge doesn't need fireworks. Sometimes the most devastating justice is quiet, leaving the guilty to wrestle with their own reflection in a room that no longer feels like home. And yet, even in that quiet victory, there was no triumph in me, only a strange emptiness, as though I had dismantled the very foundation we had once built together. Because once you expose a truth like that, you can't put the walls back up. The days after the envelope had no clear boundary. Time felt stretched, blurred, as if our apartment existed outside of calendars. We lived side by side, two actors performing a script that had long since lost its lines. Claire moved carefully now, as though every gesture might shatter glass. She no longer filled the rooms with her laughter. Instead, she filled them with pauses. I found her often standing at the window, watching the city lights, holding her wine but never drinking it. Sometimes she looked like she was waiting for something or someone that would not come. I did not press her. I did not accuse or demand. That was the point. My silence had become its own kind of verdict, one she had to carry alone. The ledger lay in plain sight, and though she never mentioned it again, she never put it away. It was both proof and punishment, quiet but constant. One night I woke to find her sitting on the floor beside the bed, the pages scattered around her like fallen leaves. She didn't cry. She just touched them one by one as if memorizing each word. When she noticed me, she didn't scramble to hide them. She simply looked at me, her eyes hollow, and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." I didn't answer, because the truth was I didn't know who she was either. From then on, our lives became a fragile balance, half companionship, half exile. We shared meals, shared space, but not trust. When friends visited, we smiled in sync as if rehearsed. When the door closed behind them, silence reclaimed the walls. Weeks passed. Some nights she stayed out late, returning with explanations too thin to matter. Other nights she clung to the couch, curling into herself as if she wanted me to notice but couldn't ask for it. And sometimes I wanted to reach out, to rebuild, to remember what we had before the fracture. But other times I felt the weight of the ledger pressing between us, reminding me that even if we tried, some truths cannot be unlearned. The end never came with fireworks. It came with a quiet morning, sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. She sat across from me, stirring her coffee, her eyes red but steady. "I can't live like this," she said finally. She didn't say whether she meant with me or with herself or with the silence that had swallowed us both. And I didn't ask. I only nodded because maybe I couldn't live like this either. That was the last conversation that mattered. She didn't leave that day or the next. Life went on, messy and unresolved. Sometimes she was there, sometimes not. Sometimes she spoke as if nothing had changed. Sometimes she fell into silence so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest. And me, I stayed in the same apartment with the same ledger with the same half-finished story. Because endings aren't clean. They aren't cinematic. They linger unfinished in the spaces between two people who once swore they belonged to each other. So when people ask what happened, I tell them the truth. We never broke up. We never stayed together. We just kept existing in that fragile place between. And maybe that was the cruelest revenge of all. Neither of us got closure. We were both left to live with the silence, and the silence never stopped speaking.